So quick question, what is the perfect model to accompany my vintage Tamiya 1/35 scale German Achrad armored car? A 1970s vintage Tamiya Panzer IV ausf.D. Hey everyone, this is John from ausf.D, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35 scale German Panzer IV ausf.D medium tank. The model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and it's not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that will be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Also, this model here is built predominantly out of the box. Essentially, what you see here is what the kit builds into. In this video, we're going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review, going over many of the model's positive attributes and detailed features, not to mention several areas that can be improved upon, and some other areas that the builder can pay attention to further enhance the experience, polishing up to basically the condition that we see here. So with all that said, there's going to be quite a bit of info coming right at you. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the German Panzer IV ausf.D. The Panzer IV is one of the most successful tanks that has ever been developed and produced in history, and this vehicle here was definitely one of the most successful vehicles produced by Germany during the World War II timeframe. Although this vehicle pattern is forever in the shadow of the Tiger and the Panther and the other overglorified big cats, the Panzer IV is actually the vehicle that did the brunt of the legwork for the Wehrmacht during World War II. Although it's not as glamorous as its big cat cousins, the Panzer IV was actually the one vehicle that was designed by the Germans during this era that was in constant production from the mid-1930s timeframe up until literally the war's end. Also, of all the vehicles that were produced, the Panzer IV was definitely the most numerous. And to make matters even better, the Panzer IV was the basis of many other vehicles utilized by the Wehrmacht during this period, from assault guns to tank destroyers to self-propelled howitzers to even flak vehicles and recovery vehicles, all of which have variants built based on the Panzer IV platform. Since this vehicle was in production for such a long period of time, there are several variants of this vehicle that trace back its production history. And this vehicle here, being the ausf.D, is one of the earlier production variants of this vehicle pattern. Of course, the Panzer IV itself dates back to the mid-1930s when Germany was rearming up, and at the time, this vehicle was based on Heinz Guderian's plans of a infantry support vehicle, or basically what's known as a breakthrough tank. A vehicle that has sufficient armor protection, but also has the type of ordnance that could knock out enemy pillboxes and fortifications, and basically keep up with the infantry in order for them to fulfill their goal. At the time, the mainstay of the German army was the Panzer III, and although that vehicle was good enough for what it was definitely not going to be sufficient with the extra armor protection and also the larger ordnance needed for this role, and that's where the Panzer IV comes into its own. After a little bit of R&D, the first vehicle of the Panzer IV was developed and was tested in the mid-1930s. From the ausf.A to the ausf.C version, a lot of bugs were being worked out in order to get the optimum armor protection as well as the optimum armament and mobility ironed out so that these vehicles can get into full production and get fielded by the German army. And by the time the ausf.D was conceived, all of these bugs were ironed out and the vehicle was basically ready to go. Also, the ausf.D was the very first of the Panzer IV pattern of vehicles to be widely produced, and also was the first pattern of this vehicle to see combat. For the vehicle's main armament, it utilized the KWK 37 75mm. The exact same armament was also utilized on a few other German vehicles of the era, so it did have cross-platform compatibility. In addition to the main armament, it utilized two secondary armaments, both of which being the MG34, one of which was mounted coaxially, and the second was mounted in the hull for the radio operator to utilize. This exact same type of layout of armament would continue with the Panzer IV from this point onward throughout the remainder of its production life. Also, this unit was the first to have an external mantlet, while the previous incarnations had the armament, or I should say, had the mantlet located on the interior of the vehicle, and with the external layout, it actually gave some better armor protection compared to the original concept. For the vehicle's power plant, it was utilizing the 300 horsepower gasoline Maybach HL120 TRM engine. This engine here was first utilized on the ausf.C version of the Panzer IV, but the ausf.D kept on using this engine, and this engine would be the engine of choice for the Panzer IV from this point onward to basically, again, to the end of its production life. By the time these vehicles entered into full production and fielding by the Wehrmacht, they were just in time for the invasion of Poland and then the subsequent campaigns in France, as well as also later on in North Africa. The vehicles were, again, in mass production, and in total, about 248 were produced. However, shortly after these vehicles began being fielded, some shortcomings with the design were noticed, and these were going to be fixed and corrected on the next production batches, which were going to be the ausf.E designation. Even though the production stopped on this vehicle over here, that doesn't mean that they were completely just banished to the scrapyard. Surviving examples kept on getting upgrade packages, which improved the armor protection with the use of applicate bolt-on armor, as well as other modifications would be added to these vehicles, keeping them up to more or less the same capabilities and specs as the newer vehicles that were coming off the production line. Fast forward to today, there are still several surviving vehicles of this platform and pattern, and they can be found in various military museums around the world. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage 1970s era Tamiya Panzer IV ausf.D plastic model kit. The Panzer IV ausf.D. This is one of those vintage kits that I actually have a little bit of love and bias towards. This kit here is a nice hidden little gem in Tamiya's lineup, and I always found these kits to be excellent for what they are and for the period that they were produced in. These models build very well, they assemble very quickly, mostly effortlessly, and on top of that, they give you a nice representation of the ausf.D version of the Panzer IV. And I'm pretty sure after making that statement, I can hear the unanimous groans and snickers of the various modeling elitists, gatekeepers, and rivet counting snobs unanimously turning their noses up in the opposite direction. And they know exactly what they could do with those remarks. Regardless, this kit here is an excellent kit, again, for what it is. These kits were originally designed by Tamiya in 1977, but the kit itself is a little bit older than that. Rewind our clocks back to the mid-1970s, Tamiya was in full force with the military miniatures line. They were producing a bunch of model kits, all of which were in 1/35th scale, more or less, and they were all intended to be motorized. In 1975, one of the releases was their original Panzer IV ausf.H. That kit gave us not only the Panzer IV ausf.H, which is a great kit in its own right, but the lower hull was rinsed, washed, and repeated by Tamiya, and they basically ran with it, developing a bunch of Panzer IV-based platform of vehicles. And these will all be released in the subsequent years that came afterwards. 1977, they went ahead and rewind the clocks back a little bit on their Panzer IV, releasing the ausf.D variant, which is a much earlier version compared to the original version, which was the ausf.H. These kits here have basically been in constant production now since 1977, and it wasn't until very recently where Tamiya decided to revisit their Panzer IV platform, where we started to see another newer edition of a vehicle similar to this one here being added to the Tamiya roster. That one is all made out of 100% new tooling, also has shitty individual Lincoln Link tracks, but that's a topic for another video. Regardless, this one over here, you know, Tamiya always had that type of attitude, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and there's a reason why this kit and many others from the same era have been in constant production basically ever since. Because of their large production numbers and long production life, these kits are ridiculously easy to find today. These models are found in hobby shops, mail order, eBay, Amazon, you name it, you throw a rock, you're probably going to find 3 or 4 vendors selling this kit. So if you're interested in getting into the hobby of plastic models, this kit here is definitely an easy one to obtain. But more on that in skill level and recommendation. For this particular example over here, this one here I picked up off of eBay, I want to say maybe 2-3 years ago, and it's been sitting in the stash ever since. It's got a little bit of dust on the surface. This particular one is one of the original releases from 1977, and there's some differences with the box as well as what the kit gives you compared to the ones that were released a couple years later in a slightly different configuration. But before I go over that information, let's first give this model a review by starting with the box art and the graphic design. So with the box art in center mass, this being a Tamiya kit features the tank behind the ubiquitous white background, and the quality of the illustration is on par with the other Tamiya kits of the era, which means it is excellent. The illustration is, oddly enough, better than the actual kit itself, and that's more often the case for these models. The illustrator did a fantastic job getting all the little fine minutiae and details found on the illustration. We have the little spring over there that keeps the front fender flap in place where it needs to be. We got the bow MG34 sprocket. The track detailing is nicely rendered out. We have the idler wheel, that little lift ladder, and all the little amenities. It has the crew right over there in their various crew positions. The graphic design is quite typical for Tamiya kits, specifically their German ones. We have a nice little iron cross over there, the ausf.D labeling, and we have the Tamiya logo up there in the upper right-hand corner. It's a thin, long, stretched out box, and this is basically the type of format that these kits were always released in. On the side tabs, we have the usual Tamiya format where we have a thumbnail version of the tank and the box art right over here. We have the Tamiya logo as well as the other information. This one here was imported by MRC in New Jersey, and this was the importer of Tamiya kits for the 1970s up until the 1990s time frame, when eventually Tamiya USA would be founded in California, and then MRC would no longer handle the importation and distribution of the Tamiya kits in the United States. This kit here, being from 1977 or at least the late 70s, would have the MRC sticker found in this section here. By the way, it's kit number 3596 in case anyone was wondering. Also, one other thing to mention, unlike many of the other Tamiya kits that came out after this era over here, this kit here was molded and made in Japan. The kits that came out in the subsequent years, Tamiya went ahead and relocated their manufacturing to the Philippines, and that is something that you will see on Tamiya kits from the later releases. But this one here, being the Gen 1 release, this guy here was manufactured in Japan. The exact same appearance and information is found on the reverse side. On this portion here, we have, again, another thumbnail of the vehicle in question, as well as an illustration of one of the figures. And we also have a brief history of the vehicle in question, but it's all written in Japanese, which I do not speak. Tamiya logo, corporate info right there. And on the reverse side, we have something pretty cool where we have little thumbnails of all the other kits in their Panzer IV lineup, or some of them, because their Panzer IV lineup was huge in the 1970s. So some of the kits that we have, or examples that we have, is the Ribblewind, the Stug 4, the Brumbar, as well as the Jagdpanzer IV L70. Oddly enough, I actually built an example of each of these, and they are in my collection, but those are all stories for another day. Regardless, these kits are all awesome, and they're all really fun builds. As I mentioned before, these kits entered into production in 1977 and stayed in production basically all the way up until the present day. During this entire time, Tamiya didn't really make any changes to the kit itself. They basically kept that the same. The only thing that they did change was when they moved the manufacturing from Japan to the Philippines, they had to make a modification to the runners as well as to the major components where it says made in Japan. That information was milled away, and they have a new plate added in that section on the mold that says made in the Philippines. Outside of that, the molds are exactly the same. The only other thing that changed was really the outer appearance of the box. The box art stayed the same, the verbiage, or I should say the main title stayed the same. What did change slightly over time was just some of the verbiage that we have here in the subtext. Also, things like a URL would be added as time went on, and the other major change was actually with this cardstock that the box is made of. On the older Tamiya kits, the box art was made out of a thicker quality of cardboard, and if you ever felt one, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Newer Tamiya kits, in comparison, the box is much thinner compared to the ones from this earlier era. So that's actually one easy way to distinguish whether or not your kit is an older one or a newer one. And why this is relevant is in case you're a collector and you're really looking for one from the early production batches as opposed to one of the later subsequent re-releases. Of course, some other things to look for would be the URL. It's obviously not made in the 70s if it has the URL found on the side, and also the sticker for the MRC label. If it's just imported by Tamiya USA, needless to say, it's a newer release kit. This particular example over here was pre-owned, obviously, and you can see from the box it does have some stains from where it was previously stored, but that's not going to be a problem for me at all. The model is not mint in box. The parts are unbagged, or at least some of them are. It's been a while since I cracked this one open. I did a brief look-see when it came in, and it's been sitting in the stash literally ever since. So I'm pretty sure all the parts are there, but we'll see what happens once I crack it open. And on that note, let's crack it open. So, like I mentioned before, the early Tamiya kits had this thicker type cardstock, and you can see on the inside portion here, this little banner that runs across, and this is something that's indicative and found on the really old generation of Tamiya kits, generally again from the 1970s time frame. It's always a nice little piece of advertisement that I always like to and always appreciate on these older kits. So, being a kit from the 1970s, you are getting a 1970s kit, which means all injection molded polystyrene, zero photo etch, zero modern amenities such as chain or turned aluminum, none of that stuff, or anything in 3D print. Old school, best school, that's what you're getting here. Everything is molded in this Panzer Gray type plastic. Again, this is quite customarily seen on the Tamiya kits. Be it, they always try to mold them for certain colors, either gray or green or tan or whatever, and they never really went with the old light gray stuff like you see on Dragon and other manufacturers. Matter of fact, Dragon was the first time I saw that. It blew my mind. Anyway, so the quality, again, you're getting molding quality technology from the late 1970s on most of the parts, and with a few of the parts molded from molds made in 1975. So it's going to be a product of its era. So starting with this runner over here, this contains the upper hull. And one thing about the D version of the kit is that it encompasses mostly new runners. The only parts that are recycled are the tracks and the lower hull. So you know what, let's start with the lower hull since, get that out of the way. Here is the lower hull of the Tamiya old school Panzer IV. If anyone has ever seen one of these before or built any of the other Panzer IV kits from Tamiya, there it is. These kits were originally motorized in the 1970s, but as far as I know, I don't think any of the ausf.Ds were ever sold in a motorized format, which is interesting because I think the sprockets are actually motorized capable with the little hex section integrally molded on, but that's something, for food for thought. On the lower section here, all the details are molded on, such as the idler mount right over here, the return roller mount, as well as the bump stops. The lower portion is absent any sort of details, like those blisters that stick and descend out of the bottom portion of the Panzer IV's hull, and we do have some motorization sections found. This would be for the switch, and this would be for securing on the gearbox in place. On the inside portion over here, we have the logo for Tamiya, and as you can see, this one here is the OG version, made in Japan, 1975. Panzer IV, and there we have the battery pictograms, as this is where the 2C batteries would be in place. This is where your battery clips would go. Your dividing bulkhead wall would go here. Fortunately, one aspect of the old school Tamiya Panzer IVs is because it was motorized and we had a bulkhead running across the sides, we have these two little square cutouts found on either side, and this is something that the builder has to plug up in order to polish the model up from its original kit configuration. This is something that will easily make or break you if you're building one of these old school Tamiya Panzer IV kits. Bottom you don't really have to worry about too much, but these ones here are way more visible with their location. With the hull set aside, you get to see the upper hull runner again. So here we have the new tooling for the upper hull. Note it has the shift found in the front armor plate, which is indicative of an earlier pattern Panzer IV. The engine grills are not, or I should say the engine hatches are not molded on. They are separate moldings, which is nice. It gives it some nice panel line details once the parts are glued on in place. And of course the front hatches are a separate molding as well. On the fender, we have the diamond plate integrally molded on. We also have some amenities such as the track racks found in these sections. And also they made the transmission axis hatches separate moldings as well, which is an interesting touch because they could easily just molded that on, you know, wouldn't have been a problem, but they went ahead and molded that separately, which means they do have some nice standoff from the rest of the model and just yields for a better quality model at the end of the day. This side here, we have some more amenities for equipment, other sorts of tools like that. And then on the remainder of the runner, we have the roof. It's the earlier pattern of Panzer IV roof with that large hatch, which is basically, I think, a ventilator, if I'm not mistaken. We have the front armor plate of the turret with those retracting armor caps. We have the mantlet. We have some interior detailing like the breech and other things like that, but you know, nothing really crazy. We have the early pattern of side escape hatches, which was a single hatch as opposed to the double ones that came later on. On the mantlet, we can see those fastener holes right over there. And we have the cupola parts, all present. The cupola is a multi-part assembly, which again leads for some nice detailing. The turret half here is just dangling for sheer life, but you get to see the quality found on this molding as well. The other turret half is right here in the box. You know, it's just a mirror image from the one on the reverse side. Here's another runner. This is all, again, completely new and just for the ausf.D. And this contains a large portion of the parts for the vehicle's upper and lower hull. So we have these two rear sections here for the rear tin work, and it has the cold weather shutoffs molded on. This is something that's present on all of these older Tamiya kits, and they just glue on right in the back section. We have here the rear plate. I believe it has some slight modifications from the standard ausf.H version of the tooling. We also have the exhaust manifold, which is much larger and longer compared to the later versions found on the ausf.H. The jack block does have some wood grain details molded on, which is a nice touch. And we have the Pioneer tools right over here. Quite standard, typical for what you'd see on kits from this era. The tool posts and tool clamps all have their subtle detailing in place. Obviously, they pale in comparison to, you know, what we see on the market today, but, you know, 1977, yeah, it's not too bad. See the jack right over there. It does have a small little sink mark in it. That's something to make note of. And there goes the armor plate for the front glasses with the squared off MG mount. Here we have the rear hatches without the grills on them. That would be a later adaptation. And here you get to see the sprockets. This is a interesting bit of detailing because the early pattern of Panzer IV sprockets had this segmented type center hub to it, which would be very different from the later versions. And Tamiya went ahead and designed that for this kit here. On the reverse side, you can see it does have the motorization option, as I mentioned before. But like I also stated, I don't recall ever seeing this kit ever offered in a motorized format, either single or dual type gearbox systems. By the mid-1970s, by the way, this was something that you saw in a lot of these Tamiya kits where they were still had the opportunity for motorization in mind, but at this time the motorization kits were being dropped and were being phased out of their catalog, and in the 1980s they were just, you know, purely static at that point, for better or for worse. One last thing I want to mention that's noteworthy on this runner are the hubcaps for the row wheels. If you note, they are separate molded sections that need to be glued on, and this was something that's a bit ahead of its time because on the other Tamiya Panzer IV kits, these were just simply integrally molded onto the wheels. Why didn't they do that with this one here? Your guess is really as good as mine, but this is something that's more or less common as you see on kits that came out after this generation here. So again, you know, a bit ahead of its time for what it is. The next runner contains the suspension parts, and this you'll see some parts that are recycled found on the other Tamiya Panzer IVs, but the entire runner itself is a new tooling just for the ausf.D. So some parts that are recycled would be things like the single piece bogie housings, which makes assembly very easy. Just simply snip them off, clean them up, and then glue them to the hull, and you could call it a day. We also have here the two options for the final drives, static and motorized. We have the road wheels. Like I stated before, the road wheels are a two-piece assembly, but you also have separate hubcaps. Again, very interesting that they went with that approach on this example. This kit also has the early style of rear idler wheel. And for the most part, it definitely is nicely molded, and it should do the job just fine. We have here some individual links to be used as spares, and that's the only thing that's going to be individual links can be used for. And the molding on them, it's pretty good for what they are. They should definitely be able to do the job just fine. We also have the idler wheels, or I should say the return rollers, right over here, and they do have their detailing molded on, or as best that they could do with the molding technology of the era. And here we have the locking mechanism that's used to make the model's upper and lower hull disconnect in case you're making the thing motorized. The next runner bag contains more parts that are again dedicated to just this release. And we have some other options. It looks like we have another set of idlers, which is strange because we already have a set of idlers here. We have two options, one with a smaller type center spindle and one with the larger center spindle. So that's an interesting choice. And we also have some options on here. For instance, another option for the rear engine hatches. The ones I showed before have no grill work present, but this one here have the first generation of grills represented. So you do have some options available on what type of build you want. We have here some spare wheels, and we also have the applicant armor, which would be bolted to the various locations on this vehicle, and that is all present on this runner set. We have some more spare track links, as well as some jerry cans, and even a rear bustle bin, as again, this is another option that this kit can be rendered in, with or without the bustle. Some of the last components to mention are the flexible ones. So we have here a set of rubber polycaps, which is a staple on these older school Tamiya kits, and a quad pack of polycaps, which are generally used for the sprockets and the idlers. And this now takes to the track, and single piece vinyls, God's chosen track manufacturing method. These parts have been in the bag for so long that you can see where they were folded and rubber band together, and you'll notice that that amber rubber band that were used on all these Tamiya kits got so old that it just brittled up and dried into oblivion. This is something that you'll see on these older school Tamiya kits that were still in this type of condition. Not uncommon. Fortunately, the rubber band did not mold itself or melt into the track. I have seen in the past sometimes that happens, but it's never anything that's really bad or anything. It's just sometimes they get stuck and just chip them off, and off they go. But there you go. Tracks have been cleaned up and they look fantastic. This is probably one of the biggest points of contention on this model, is that they just recycled the tracks that they were using on the other versions of their Panzer IV. And this includes the one with the ice clits that we see right here. This is more of a mid-production type track. Now, when it comes to Panzer IV, there's like half a dozen type of tracks available, and there are people crazy enough that can tell you which ones would be appropriate for which pattern of Panzer IV. This one here is definitely not something that you generally see on a Panzer IV of this vintage, or the ausf.D platform. And also, with the width, some of the earlier versions of the Panzer IV actually had more narrower gauge track compared to these ones here. So again, this is something that is probably one of the weaker aspects of the kit. However, is that going to thwart me from using these? Oh, hell no. These tracks are going to be perfectly fine, and they're going to be adorning this model, you guarantee it. As for the quality of tracks, the old school Tamiya Panzer IV tracks are actually pretty good for the era, and even, they still hold up today by and large. If the camera zooms in, you can see the quality of the moldings found on the face pattern of the track. And on the inner portion of the track, we also have the segmented links. So that's a nice little bit of detailing that was absent on some of the other kits offered by Tamiya, and also were absent on a few of the other manufacturers of the era. Digging down deeper in the box takes us to the decal sheet. As you can see, this one has been pirated. The decals are the water slide type, of course, and this was one of the earlier patterns where it had the white paper backing. Later on, when these kits were continuing their manufacturing, the decal stayed the same with the actual file itself, but what changed was with the printing and also the paper. They went from this white paper to the blue, the typical blue paper backing that we see on decals today. But the quality of these decals have always been pretty good. I found the older decals seem to hold up very well with age, and they generally go on without any sort of problems. And just like with the new ones, they tend to varnish and secure onto the vehicle very well. So hopefully that'll be the case with these ones here. But in the past, I've always had some excellent results with these old school decals. Also, as you can see, you have the option to render this vehicle out in a couple different configurations. I think 3 total. So, that's something to keep in mind. Here we have the instruction sheet. It's a Tamiya, so we have some really cool background information here of the vehicle in question. And the instructions are quite typical for a Tamiya. Needless to say, shouldn't be any problems with getting this one built and assembled. And not just that, this thing will probably be rolling off of my production line in absolutely no time. Here you get to see all the different options for markings you have for this vehicle, so that's great. You could buy 4 or 5 of these things and have no 2 look alike, so that's fantastic. On the very bottom of the box, wouldn't be a Tamiya kit from the late 70s, early 80s time frame without the little mini catalog that we have right over here, and I just love these things. I went over these pamphlets in detail in a few of my other videos, but these kits, I love stuff like this. We got the M2 and the M3 Bradley right over there, one with the interior, which is a great kit. I actually built one that should be found on the ECA channel. The RC959. This is just basically my old childhood when it comes to thumbing through these really kick-ass Tamiya catalogs. Old school M1 Abrams right over there. Merkava, T62, Challenger 1, M3 Bradley, the Leopard 1A4, M4A3, the Grief, the original old school clutch drive Tamiya King Tiger, and also the M151 Mutt with the tow missile launcher. At the time, that was cutting edge technology. So, there we have it. A walk down memory lane, which will now lead us directly to the builder's bench. Fast forwarding a little bit, and here we have the model in its course of production. So, one thing I want to mention at this time involves the areas on the Tamiya pattern Panzer IVs that are something that should be paid attention to, and this is something that's best done now as opposed to when the model is fully completed. So starting with the lower hull, we have right here a little bit of bodywork that's done on these 2 locations. As I mentioned before, or as one would easily determine from looking at the inside, when the vehicle was originally designed, it was intended to be motorized, and during that motorization type period, there were these 2 holes that were found in these sections here for a bulkhead to clip in place, which gives you the battery terminals as well as the switch. Well, one side effect is that you have these 2 holes that are found on the side sections of the hull that are very prominent, very noticeable, and it's something that can hurt the look of the model. So this is something that needs to be addressed by the builder if you're just going to build it in a static format, or even in a motorized format for that matter. Regardless, this is just accomplished with some basic body work. The way I went ahead and did this was I took some pieces of Plastruct square stock that I had floating around, and I clipped it to the correct size, as you can see a little bit of it over there, glued it in place, and once that dried, some body work was then added over it. This would include both the use of red putty as well as super glue, and then I wet sanded it to the flush condition that we have here. At some point I am going to add a little bit of primer in this section just to check to see if this is something that's been completely removed, as this is something that if you don't take care of and nick it in the bud right now, it's going to come around and bite you later on in the build. Outside of that, the lower hull goes together extremely quickly and effortlessly. I mean, it is an old school Tamiya after all. On the back portion over here, first thing I am going to mention is that with a pin vise, I add a small little hole in the tow hitch area. It's molded solid on the model, and on the real unit, this is obviously for the tow hitch, so a small little hole is generally found on the real unit, so it was added on this one. Done with a pin vise, real short order, and it's a nice way to help polish the model further. On the exhaust manifold, of course, this is a multi-part assembly, and just like on every other model that has a feature similar to this, I went ahead, pre-assembled it, and pre-primed it off the model so that I could go ahead and make sure that the seam work was completed, and the seams on this one here were blended away with the same methods that I mentioned before, the use of a needle file and some fine sandpaper. After a few moments of some polishing, the unit was then primed, and as you can see, there are no surprises, and everything looks exactly as it should. The next thing I want to mention is with the upper hull, and this is something that is really true for not just the Tamiya pattern of Panzer IVs, but many other vehicles of the same type. With the way the Panzer IV is, we have these grills found in the back section, and these are features that are really hard to get paint into, specifically once the tin work goes on and the model progresses past this point. These are the type of things that you will sometimes miss with the paint, or it will take several layers of paint to get into this area over here, and even in those type of circumstances, there may be an occasion where you might miss a spot or two. So on this point in the build, you can see that I went ahead and masked everything up, and I hit this area here with a little bit of flat black spray paint because I use that as my primer. With the unit fully painted at this point, there are no areas where the plastic is left exposed, and so when it comes time for paint work, the paint could flow into these sections over here, and if there's a small area where the paint just can't get to, at least it'll have the black showing through as opposed to bare plastic. A similar procedure was done to the rear sections over here, for one of the reasons being for the same reason. The unit was just hit with the flat black, and then now that everything is dry, I could go ahead and glue it in place. Another idea, if someone's wondering, is yes, you can also add a little bit of the base coat in these sections over here to really thoroughly coat everything to make sure that there is absolutely nothing missed. And this is something that can be done either with the airbrush or paintbrush. However, I'm not going to do that at this time for the simple reason that I'm not really sure what base coat I'm going to utilize on this build. I have a couple different colors of the color I'm looking to use, and I'm not sure which one I'm going to go with for this particular example. So this is something I'm going to postpone till later on during the build. However, at least I have the areas here primed, so this gives me a leg up compared to just going in raw with the pieces left in bare plastic and trying to get the primer into these sections, which is something that's a bit tricky. Circling back to the tin work, like I mentioned before, the units were primed, but not just for the reason that I just mentioned, but another reason was because for the intersection over here, I also did some body work. With the stock Tamiya part, we do have several injection pin holes in these sections, and this is something that, in my opinion, can't hurt the look of the build. Even though it is on the underside and it's not really that visible, it's just one of those things that bugs me, and since I have the opportunity, I might as well take care of it. The units were plugged up with some of the red putty, as well as some super glue, polished down to the format that we have here, and as you can see, it is nice and smooth. On a similar note, I went ahead and did a similar procedure to the tin work. On this section, you can see the areas where the injection pins were blended away, and from this point here I could continue with the remainder of the build. But there is something else I'm going to be adding to this model in these sections over here, and let's just cut across to one that has already been accomplished. And here's the upper hull with those modifications added. One thing that's a staple found on a lot of the older tooling Tamiya kits is the absence of a sponson. This is something that's seen on their kits from the 1970s, and it continued all the way up until really the 1990s. It wasn't until very recently was when Tamiya moved away from this type of a setup, which is a positive, but then they go ahead on the flip side and give you individual link and lane tracks. So talk about 1 step forward, 8 steps back. But for the purposes of this video over here, all of the Tamiya Panzer IVs, or I should say the legacy Panzer IVs, are absent with their sponsons. And this is something that I always like to remedy on my builds, as it makes the model just more solid and just more complete overall. The sponsons themselves are fabricated out of lengths of Plastruct strip. In fact, I have one right over here. I believe this is about a 1/2 inch wide and about 1/16 of an inch thick. These type of strips can be found in just about any hobby shop, or also you can pick it up online on Amazon, as what a lot of people do these days. As for the fabrication, that's done with making some templates. I took some blue painter's tape over here. I basically filled the area in and I marked it with a pencil, and then I was able to cut the template to shape. From here, I'm able to take the template and stick it onto the piece right here. And now I have my template. So I removed this section over here, cut it to shape, and then it's ready for installation onto the model. If anyone is curious on how I actually make these templates, well, I'm going to be going over that in more depth in an OTR on one of these models. That is something that's going to be posted on the channel at some point in the future. But regardless, as you can see, the installation is pretty straightforward. The upper and lower hulls are ready for mating now, and the way I did this, I actually recycled the old motorizational clips because why not? I have the parts, I might as well use them for something, as opposed to just letting them languish away my spare parts bin for years on end, because I doubt very much I'm going to be utilizing these parts anytime soon. And I think I already have a number of them already in there. Anyway, regardless, the way they work, because this is one thing that's not really shown in any of the instructions, is you have these two claws that are in these two sections over here. They look like candy canes, or these giant angle canes type sections. They get glued to the front armor plate. These two clips get glued to these two little sections or recesses that are found into the top deck, and then there's a large tab section that gets glued into the rear plate. And the way this works is you basically line up the front section like this, slide that forward so those two front sections clip in place, and then this guy here would just snap into the appropriate location found on the rear hull. Once it's installed, this thing is actually rock solid and it doesn't go anywhere. Starting with the model suspension and the running gear, all the components here are stock and they were built out of the box without any sort of problems. Also at this time, I just want to bring your attention to the midsection over here to point out that the hole that was found on the side section of the armor was plugged up and blended away thoroughly with the bodywork. When you're doing this procedure, it's best to do this before the swing arm bogey housings get mounted in place, as when you are working on the model without these pieces in their locations, it makes for an easier, more accessible area to get in there with the sandpaper and the putty to do what you have to do. Once the bodywork is completed, the side section is totally seamless and the model is much more improved. Of course, this is true for not just the one side, but it's also true on the opposite side as well. Back to the running gear, all of the rubber components have been painted to replicate rubber. This would include all of the main tires on the road wheels, the tires on the return rollers. Remember, these early Panzer IVs, the return rollers would be rubber rimmed, and also the bump stops, which is something a lot of people negate on their models. The bump stops on the Panzer IV family are actually made out of rubber, and so I simply painted them to resemble that material. It's one of those little details that a lot of people again miss, and if you go ahead and add it, it just improves your builds overall. Moving our way to the sprocket, nothing much to talk about here. Stock sprocket goes together perfectly out of the box, and at times even perfectly more with this stock track. The only thing I do want to mention, this is a ding with the Tamiya Panzer IV ausf.D kit, aside from the track width that I touched upon before, is that on early versions of, or I should say on all of the versions of the Panzer IV ausf.D that I've seen photographs of, there is this little shield found on the section here protecting the final drive on the inner portion area, and this is a bit of detailing that's omitted on the Tamiya kit. Oddly enough, it's found on the box art, but it's not present on the actual tooling, and again, this is just what you expect to see on a kit from this era. Is this something that's a deal breaker? That depends, but again, if you're one of those people that are really looking for a super detailed, accurate version of the Panzer IV ausf.D, this is not exactly going to be the kit for you, per se. Moving back brings us to the idler wheels. They were, again, the kit supply ones, and I painted the front section, or I should say the face section, with steel because these are steel rimmed and they would scratch up very quickly with use. The other thing I want to mention is an addendum to what I stated earlier, where the kit does supply with two options of rear idler wheels, and there's a reason for that. One option is for if the tank is being made motorized, and the other option is if you're going static. This version here is the motorized variant, and the difference is again the size of the center spindle and the hubcap. Because the motorized one needs to have a polycap and the provisions and space for the polycap to fit inside, to me I have to fudge the numbers a little bit in order to allow the recesses for this still to function and have the detailing. However, the other variant is the static one, and that one does not have any sort of provisions for the polycap, and it's just made to be glued to the rear spindle of the idler mount. For this one here, I went with the motorized one, but it's something that you want to pay attention to. The motorized one still works and does the job perfectly fine, but this is something that you may want to address on your build and make sure you use the right one. Either way, both wheels still look great and fitted to the vehicle, and obviously I use this one here, but I also use the other one on the other variants, which again is something to be seen on another video. Either way, it's just a small little detail, but it's just something to keep in mind. Moving to the track, nothing really much to mention here. Stock track, single piece vinyl, awesome, use them out of the box. But the one thing you do want to pay attention to are with the teeth on these Tamiya Panzer IV, old school Panzer IV tracks. The way these pieces are molded is the injection pin sections of sprue are molded on some of the main teeth sections of the track. And these are very easily remedied with a clean cut snip. You just go ahead and you snip them off, give it basically a haircut, and once you're done, the piece is ready for painting. And that's basically the only thing to watch out for on those tracks. The other thing to mention is what I always mention in these videos: don't use enamels or spray paints on tracks, specifically single piece vinyls. They have the potential of having a negative effect, which can either melt the track outright or can cause dry rot later on, and next thing you know, you'll look at your tank and the tracks have just disintegrated into oblivion. So definitely this is something to be aware of. In their place, instead of using spray paints for my tracks, I utilize Tamiya acrylic bottled paint, and I apply it to the track surfaces via the airbrush. And so far I've had kits now past the 10-year point painted with this medium, and it hasn't caused any sort of issues. So if you're looking for longevity, definitely roll with that option. As for the remainder of the weathering, it's done via the airbrush as well as also dry brushing, giving you the distressed steel look that we see here that are quite customarily seen on my builds. Also on the rear section, you get to see the convoy lights. We have the rear blackout light over here. It's flipped downward, so we have the little squares that are represented. These are green on the real German vehicles, so a little swipe of Tester's enamel green is what I utilize on my builds, and it always does the job just perfectly. On the opposite side, we have the other type of convoy light where it's orange on top and red on the bottom. And on the mud flap over here, it's something that can easily be missed with a little quick blink, but integrally molded on is the small little reflector. It's very, very tiny. It's arguably underscaled, but the detailing is still there. Further enhances just a small little drop of gloss red right over there, and you're good to go. Also on the tin work, the kit does give you the little spring detailing. It's pretty fiddly, but it's a nice feature that they do have, and you could arguably say way ahead of its time. Same is also true for the one on the front, but I will say the one on the front, it's a little bit more fiddly to get into place because there are no set locations for the spring to be mounted. The one on the back, it's pretty cut and dry. We have these two little nubs, and each nub goes on one location on the fender, the other one on the rear mud flap, while the one on the front here, it's more of a guesstimation, best way to put it. It's not really a major thing, but it's one of those things that'll just bug you when you're going through these builds. And the same is true for not just this kit, but all of the original old school tooling kits, the Panzer IV kit specifically from Tamiya. Back to the rear front area, we have the front toe shackle points, stock from the kit. They go together pretty well. They are a two-piece assembly, and it's one of those things as a beginner you can easily break or not glue these on properly. They're a little fiddly in that regard, but once you have your ducks in a row, they actually go together pretty well. And we also have here the front transmission axis hatches. These are separate moldings, which again is quite interesting that they did that because they didn't necessarily have to do that, but that they went with that route. It makes for a better detailed model in that regard. Also at this point here, you get to see all of the tin work detailing. On this side, we have the headlight, the tools. We have here a spare track rack. These are the spare track links that are supplied with the kit, painted, weathered, and then dropped into the appropriate locations. And on this side here, we have the antenna channel. The antenna channel on these old, or I should say on these very early war pattern of German tanks were actually made out of wood. This is something a lot of people miss out there. So for the weathering, I actually dry brushed some brown on it to give it that distressed wood look, which is what you would see as the piece would age. Also, the antenna bases are right over here on these older units, and these actually retract. It's a feature that was found on these older pattern of, or early pattern of German tanks, eventually dropped for the stereotypical rubber base that we all know of. But the older ones were actually a bunch of like leaf springs, and the piece would actually flex around. The one thing I want to mention is that the piece is ready for mounting of a wire, but it has a little shallow divot integrally molded on. To increase the surface area, I like to drill it out with a pin vise with a very small Dremel bit, just so there's more meat and surface area for the wire to plug into. Otherwise, this piece is going to be popping off on you all the time. And with this vehicle over here, the turret is always going to hit it when you are rotating the turret. Even during photography and filming of this video, I've already bumped into it more often than not, bending the wire. If the piece was just held in place with the shallow design of the kit, I would have had the super glue on hand to constantly re-glue it in. But if you drill it out, it gives it better structure. If you do not have the skill sets or the tools for this procedure, don't do it. Either leave it with the antenna off or just carefully glue a piece of wire in and call it a day. It's one of those things where if you don't have the technique, you could possibly screw it up. Also, while on the side sections here, you can see that this vehicle has been up-armored with the kit-supplied armor sections. And to do this, you actually have to slightly change and alter some of the locations for the tools. I believe the shovel was one that it's not really set in stone. They basically just have a drawing of where it goes. No real indications on the kit. So when you're feeling everything out, you first want to install the antenna channel and then just make sure that the shovel fits in accordingly. But that's something you want to keep aware of. On that note, with the front section over here, you need to make sure that you make the decision to go with the armor or go without the armor early on, because if you don't have the armor, you're going to, or I should say, if you do have the armor and you glue this little lifting lug over here, you're going to have to rip it off and remount it. This is definitely something you want to pay attention to. As this piece here, you only have enough to assemble the kit and there's no spares, so you want to be careful, not just making sure it doesn't go to Lost Partia, but you want to make sure that if you're going to go with the build, make sure you know if you're going to go with the armor or without, and just move on from there. The armor differences also affect the frontal armor detailing as well. On the frontal section, there are several details that need to be omitted, or I should say there's the one major detail that needs to be omitted, which is like a sun visor that goes over the front visor here for the driver's DV. If you're going with the armor, that gets omitted because the armor gets fitted in place. And also, one common mistake I've seen out there on the internet with this kit is, without fail, when they're gluing the armor sections on, again, it's more or less a suggestion. There's no real mounting points found on the kit, so you have to use your eye. And this can lead issues because I have seen several on Google, when you Google up this kit, where they have these two sections glued butt up against each other, which is great because it does fit that way. But then when you realize you just covered up the visor slot for the driver and the guy's going to be basically blind. So that is something you want to be aware of when you're building one of these kits and you're rolling with the armor. As for the MG section, no problem there. It goes out without any sort of problems. On the barrel, you can see that I actually went ahead and drilled the barrel section out. Again, very commonly done on my builds. With the right tools, you can do that, and the right skill sets. If you don't have those, don't do it because you can easily screw it up. This is here is very, very tiny and there's no margin for error. So definitely you don't want to do it unless you know what, or I should say you have, again, your ducks in a row for that type of application. On the reverse side, we have some more Pioneer tools. Basically everything is kit supplied, go in their appropriate locations, and they fit very well. On this area here, again, you have some options available to you. If you are installing the vehicle with the spare tire in the back, the tool layout does differ slightly, but again, this also is somewhat mentioned fairly well in the instruction manual. As for the tools themselves, we have the cleaning staves right here for the 75. They are painted in my usual format, where the staves themselves would be wood, and the end connectors are brass. Again, this is something I always recommend to do on your build. It's a great way to add so much extra detailing with the minimum amount of work. A little swipe of gold paint on the front and rear sections and you're good to go with the end connectors. And then for the swab itself, I painted it with Tamiya Field Gray. The swabs would usually have a field gray, or I should say just a uniform colored canvas bag just to protect the swab section, and with the way it's molded, it looks like it has that section molded in. So simply paint that with the color I said, and the piece will look much more improved. And again, just gives more character and color pop to the build, and it just breaks up the monotony of a single tone tank like you see here. Also on this area, we have the distinctive little ladder found in this location. What's interesting is that the kit gives you two of these ladders. I'm not sure why. There's no other ladder found on the opposite side, nor are there any provisions for such, so I guess the other one's just a spare in case you break this one. To be fair, it is in a pretty snag-prone location, specifically if the tank was motorized. Also, generally, these would be folded up. However, they just look really cool deployed like you see here, and I just rolled with it in that format. When you're installing this, by the way, you want to do this after the track is installed. Obviously, this kind of gets in the way, and when you're installing the track, you definitely don't want to fiddle and mess around with this. So, install the track, then you can go ahead and install the little ladder over here, and you can proceed from there. But of course, this is done at the tail end of the build. Do not be one of those guys that paints your tanks with the wheels and track installed. That's just cringe. Don't do that. Just don't. Just do like the real tank. The track gets installed at the very tail end of the build. So do that and you should be good to go. Same with the wheels. Going upward brings us to the rear engine deck. Very, very minimalistic on the ausf.D pattern vehicles. The kit, again, does give you the option to have the versions with the air vents, but that is if you're rendering it for North Africa. This being rendered for Europe, that's not going to be found. The piece just dropped directly in place. Nothing really much to mention here. Just you don't want to be overzealous with the glue, as it can ooze out through the panel lines here, and it can ruin the look. So that's definitely one of the aspects to watch out for. The handle, nice and simple to install, but again, you want to be careful that you don't break it during removal from the sprue and also mounting. On the front section here, you can see the bow hatches, again, stock out of the box. No, nothing really much to mention there. And this brings us to the turret. So the turret on this kit goes together fairly well. However, you can tell that this kit was designed to utilize thicker tooling-based adhesives of the day, namely stuff from like testers. The reason why I say that is because the turret has these two heads that got to get glued together, and of course there will be a seam in this section over here. However, there's no real positive mounting or snap system in order to have the two units secure in place very sturdily, specifically if you're using thinner type cements. If you're using those brush-on cements that some people like to use, or in my case, I use super glue. So the thicknesses back here, I should say the thicknesses of the sections are fairly thin, and because of that, arguably they are a bit frail, specifically before you mount on the front plate and also the roof. Once those get fitted onto place, it kind of acts like a box structure, and it holds it very well. Either way, you will have a seam to contend with in this location over here. And that was basically the most work required on the model. Took a few coats of super glue and polishing to make sure it was nice and blended away smooth, and there's absolutely no lump or anything remaining of the bodywork in question. But once it polished away, it made for a decent, or I should say, it leaves for a nice end result. If you're going with the North Africa one, there's a bin that gets fit in this location here, but again, you want to take care of the bodywork before you add that in place. It just makes for a better build. Yes, the tank does have some partial turret interior. I went ahead and assembled it out of the box. Didn't paint it, obviously. I just went and built everything with the kit components just so I have less parts floating around in my spare bin. And they go together fairly well. Again, it's very basic, minimalistic interior at that. The locations for the catcher over here are pretty thin, so it's one of those pieces where you want to be careful when you're gluing everything together. You want to do it in layers. Make sure you glue parts on, let them set and dry, and then progress on there until you get the last pieces fitted in place. Nothing really much to mention about that. On the front section over here, it does fit on pretty well. There is some shifting that can happen. There are, again, no positive locking points for the front plate to get secured to the turret. So you want to use your eye. After the main two half sections are glued in place and are glued properly, then you can go ahead and slip this on and adjust accordingly. While on the topic of seam work, takes us to the mantle, and this is another area where there's some seam work to contend with, namely with the way the oval section here, or the main area, gets assembled. There's a top and bottom section, which means we have a seam on either side. Easily addressed, easily polished away, but best done before you install it to the mantle itself, and also with the other details that are fitted in place. The stubby 75 section over here just gets installed onto this area, but you would want to have the bodywork done before you do that, because you run the risk of accidentally polishing away the seam that's found on these two sections, which would be there on the part in real life. It's a natural seam, and it's one of the areas where you actually want to leave the seam work. And this is best done, again, if you just go ahead and address the bodywork before you do the rest of the installation. Rest of the installation goes by pretty well. The coax MG section was drilled out, again, same reasons I always mention. And also one detail that I scratch built was the strap here that holds the counterweight in place. Counterweight just gets glued to the bottom portion, and it's a bit fiddly. there's nowhere else that really gets mounted to the thing where it doesn't really make contact with the mantlet over here. And it's just one of those pieces that can easily get bumped off. So when you're gluing this on, make sure it's mounted on appropriately. Just look at some reference areas out there and make sure you adjust accordingly. But one other detail that I had to scratch with was the strap. You can see the strap that we have here on the real unit. This thing would actually just slip onto this area, and then it basically has like a hose clamp, lack of a better phrase for it, that tightens with a fastener and secures to this area here, and then it's held on securely in place. The strap here is absent on the stock tooling, and it was just fabricated out of a thin little piece of soda can aluminum that was cut to shape, and I had a small little piece of 3D print sprue left over from a project, and I utilized that for the little fastener detailing. Quick piece to fabricate, and once done, it greatly improves the model, leaving for the results that you see here. Also in this section, you can see the barrel section. I went ahead and painted the inside with silver, as again, it would be like that on the real vehicle. Remainder turret pieces go on without any sort of problems. They're maybe a bit fiddly in that they're kind of small, so if you're careful with the removal and deburring, this is something that can easily shoot off lost party, namely something like these little lift lugs that I mentioned before. But if you're careful and the planets line up appropriately, you should be just fine. Also, there aren't really any real indication points on where they get fitted in place, so you want to make sure, measure twice and glue once to make sure everything lines up in the same location and they are in the appropriate location at that. And then this takes us to the cupola, which is a ridiculously complex for the day component. It is a multi-piece assembly. There's like 4 or 5 parts that got to get removed off the sprue, deburred, and assembled in place. Fortunately, the assembly goes by pretty easily. They can only go on in one way, and once they are assembled, the piece goes together very well. And that's all there is to mention about the detailing. This takes us directly to the paint and the markings. For the paintwork on this one, I wanted to make it look like the classic box art that this kit does have. So, single tone, Panzer Gray, or Schwarzgrau was going to be the way to go. Usually, I would roll with either one of my exterior latexes. However, for this one, I wanted to go with the Tamiya route. So, the paint I used was, for the base coat, Tamiya Panzer Gray acrylic, and that was applied via the airbrush. But of course, before I did that, the entire tank was thoroughly primed with, you guessed it, El Cheapo flat black spray paint. After spray paint was added, the Tamiya was then added over it with full opacity. Once the Tamiya paint was added, it then went through the various weathering techniques to try to bring it up to the, or make it look as close to the box art as possible. And these techniques were utilizing the airbrush once again. I went with a wash of a white, I believe, in order to, a diluted white, in order to get the sun fading effects. For the counter shading, I go with Tamiya flat black, diluted in the airbrush, and I airbrush it strategically on certain locations, giving you for the look that you see here. Once the airbrushing is concluded, I then go ahead and go with the dry brushing with flat black with a fan brush to get the chipped painting, or I should say the chipped paint effects that are commonly seen on my builds. And once that's concluded, the model then goes ahead and gets its decals. The decals are the kit supply ones. This kit did have those old white paper backing decals, and for the most part, they went on okay. They were a bit touch and go at times because of the age of the markings. Sometimes the paper is so dried up that even when submerged in the water, it takes a while for the glues to thoroughly melt on the decal, but they do eventually melt, and when they do, I was able to get the piece slid off of the backing. I did have a couple occasions where they ripped slightly, but I was able to piece the piece together, and I was able to make do regardless. The hardest part on the markings, specifically if you're building this version here, number 421, is you have to get the markings to overlap on that infernal periscope. There is this visor in this section over here, and it is a pain in the ass because you have to try to get that decal to fit over it, and it is a boxing match. So much so that for the decal, I actually have to make several incisions on the decal itself with a sharp X-Acto, just so that the decal can be overlaid onto the part in a flat manner. This was probably the most amount of work on the markings. After the decals were set in place, the entire model was then coated with the VMS matte varnish, leaving for the end results that you see here. On some areas on the visors, I then had to cut out the little visor section And then I painted that area with a little bit of gloss black just to get that little periscope sheen. I guess it's this one over here. It's a little tricky to get on camera, but that is something that I had to do. If you're going with this decal, you want to make sure you do that. Otherwise, you're basically...
You're gonna have a bad time.
Another area where the decal is going to be a bit tricky for you, the builder, is this one over here where we have the antenna well. The decal needs to be surgically cut and then cut again in order to get the decal to fit in the appropriate location. It's really doable, but it's one of those things where you have to pay attention and just have some steady hands as the builder, because the decal has to go in this section over here. It would be wonderful if it could go over here, but it needs to go here. So when you're working on one of these models, bear that in mind. The other area is also, again, on the 421 right here in the back section with the curvature of the turret. It can be a little tricky, but if you use the microset microsol and you massage the decal in place, it tends to stay pretty well. On other areas where I had to make the incisions, I blended in with the weathering, with the chipping effects, which is great. Also, I used some flat white strategically placed to take care of any areas that have sufficient gaps left over from the overlap procedure. Even though you overlap everything in place, you will still have a gap or two just with the geometry and the standoff of the visors in place. And this is something that can hurt the look, but if you go in there with a little paintbrush with some flat white, it makes everything blend in. Again, after all the markings were fitted in place, the entire model was coated with VMS matte via the airbrush, leading for the end results that we have here. They did a fantastic job with making the decals as flat as possible, and it just leaves for a nice finished glowy model, and it always looks fantastic once done. For the exhaust manifolds, I utilized Sophisticated Finishes rusting agent, which is real rust. It's this iron filing type paint. You brush it on, and you carefully apply a activator agent, has a chemical reaction, and the rust will start growing on the part. After a while, after about several months or so, the piece will have the look that you see here. I did airbrush some exhaust weathering on it, but as usually what happens, the rust tends to overtake it over time, much along the lines as it would on the real vehicle. However, all said and done, I think it looks really great, and it looks as close to the box art example as I can possibly get, and that again just puts a big smile on my face. And of course, why not? I have the opportunity. This is a build straight out of the 70s, so I have another German early war build from Tamiya from the 70s right here coming in, which is the Achrad armored car. Both of these kits definitely work very well with each other, and it's a good thing that I have both of them represented in the collection. Also, the paintwork is different on the two. They're both painted with Tamiyas. However, some of the washes are slightly different between the two. This one here, I added an extra effect to it, given for the final look that you see. But again, it's great to have variation and differentiation, which you're painting on your models. It just makes your collection just look that much more flavorful, and it prevents it from being myopic. Also, it's a case point, letting you know that no matter how old or vintage the kit's tooling is, at the end of the day, it just matters to a good paint job. You have a good paint job, the simplest kit will always end up looking really good. And even though these two kits are as old and as simplistic as they are, in my opinion, they definitely still hold their own. In the end, I couldn't have imagined this build turning out any better compared to the way we see it here. This is literally exactly what I envisioned when I first took this build on and I cracked the box open for the first time to start the construction. I had an absolute blast while working on this one, and this is something that's not uncommon for a Tamiya kit build. Tamiya kits are basically the gold standard out there for enjoyable and easygoing builds, and for the older kits, specifically the ones from the era that this kit was made in, this is definitely true. There's just something with these kits. There's this secret sauce in the ingredients, and it just makes for a fun, enjoyable build experience. And there's a reason why these kits have stuck around with this as long as they have, and probably will continue to do so. Which is a perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendations. So, unlike many of the other builds that are on this channel where I say, yeah, it was a great build, but I can't really recommend this to a beginner, it's more of an intermediate or of an advanced build type kit, this one here, that's not necessarily the case. This kit here, and it's also partly due to the reason why it's still with us and been around for so long, is something that can theoretically be built by a beginner. I know this is something that's not really commonly said on this channel, but that is true. These builds here, or I should say these kits here, do assemble very easily and mostly effortlessly. If you stick with the out-of-the-box components and you have the most minimum of plastic modeling skills, you too can throw one of these kits up together. As for painting, that's another story for another day, but even in paint work, because the model is just simply Panzer Gray, you can cobble together the paint job and have some decent results even if you don't have some advanced tooling like an airbrush or things along those lines. There are some over-the-counter spray paints that are primer gray that mimic the German dark Panzer Gray actually quite well. But again, that's a topic for another day. This is not something that I can say for many other kits that are on the market. But for this one over here, yeah, if you're a beginner, you can probably tackle one of these and have some decent results. Again, the caveat is that you have some very basic modeling skills, i.e. sprue removal, carefully removing or deburring parts, and knowing exactly how much glue to apply to an object. If you can figure those out, this build here, you can actually tackle. Obviously, if a beginner can tackle this kit, an intermediate builder should have absolutely no problems with one of these models here. As for an advanced builder, chances are they've already built one of these because they're generally a certain vintage. And on top of that, they could probably tackle one of these with their eyes closed. Probably the biggest amount of work that was involved in this build was just dealing with some of the seam removal on several of the parts I mentioned before, namely the exhaust manifold and the mantlet, not to mention the turret. If you can get those skills in a row, this build definitely is one that becomes viable. And this now pivots us to recommendations, and in my opinion, this is where this kit really becomes interesting. As I mentioned before, this kit can be built by basically anyone from the beginner for the intermediate to the advanced. However, people that have the intermediate and the advanced skill sets generally are looking for something that's a bit more challenging and also something that has higher detail fidelity. And although this kit over here builds very well and it's a very fun and positive build experience, this does come at the expense of detail fidelity. This kit, of course, is a vintage model kit through and through, and this is a product of its era. And during this time, the designers that came up with this kit over here did take some liberties and shortcuts in order to get the kit to be able to be produced efficiently and also to be produced in a simplistic manner. And this comes at the expense of having several errors. I already touched upon a few in this video, but I'm pretty sure if you're so inclined, you go on the forums, and I'm pretty sure they'll be going over all of the mistakes that this kit has in an itemized list. And generally someone who has a more advanced skill sets, they are looking for something that has all of these details ironed out, and the vehicle is much more closely representing the real vehicle in terms of detail fidelity. And if that is the build that you're looking for, then most certainly this is definitely not going to be the kit for you. If you are looking for that type of a build experience, then I would recommend steering more towards one of the more modern tooling kits that have been released in the last 20 or so years. Some competitive options would be from TriStar as well as Dragon come to mind. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a few people commenting in the comment section on how much Dragon kits suck, but that's a topic for another video. Either way, those kits are much more refined and are far more advanced as well as more detailed compared to the vintage kit that we have here that was designed back in the mid-1970s. However, that doesn't mean we can rule this kit out and put it to the dustbin of history, because this kit, along with basically every other kit out there, does have its place in the hobby. As I always say, more options available to the consumer wins. And there's a reason why this trylodite of a kit is still with us today, and that's because it still fulfills a lot of needs and a lot of angles to the industry in a very efficient way. And because this kit fulfills that role very well is why, in my opinion, it becomes very interesting. So, straight out of the gate, who I'd recommend this kit to is anyone who's just a casual builder. So let's just say you're someone that built a few plastic models before, but you're not really that crazy about it. You know, you're just in it for the hobby, build one or two kits now and then, and it's a way to pass the time. If you're that type of person, this kit is fantastic for you because it definitely scratches that itch. If you like this vehicle, say you play the video games, that's another one I would recommend this kit to. Anyone who's just a fan of playing those online video games, I know this vehicle is in them. Say you absolutely love this tank, you have a lot of fun with it, and you just want to have a model built to represent the one in the video game, this kit here is recommended for you because it builds well, it's affordable, it's very plentiful, and on top of that, generally, these type of people don't necessarily have or the desire to build one of the more crazy, advanced, highly detailed super kits, but you're just looking for a simplistic build that gives you the look and feel of the Panzer IV ausf.D. That's you, boom. This kit here cannot be recommended enough. Again, the most positive attributes this kit has is the ease of construction, the availability, and the relatively low cost. With these three attributes that this kit has, this definitely makes it a perfect contender for a practice build. What I mean by that, let's just say you are the type of person that has one of the more advanced, expensive kits in your collection, but you're not really sure how to paint it. Say you saw a painting or weathering tutorial on YouTube, you want to give it a try, but you don't want to wing it on the first try with one of those expensive kits. Well, this one over here becomes very handy. Because of how fast and easy the thing builds up, you can quickly build one of these, experiment with one of those painting techniques or weathering techniques, see what works for you, and then once you have your ducks in a row, you could use this one as a dry run. You could then apply those exact same skills to the more advanced kit and not worry about potentially screwing it up. As I mentioned before, a beginner can tackle one of these models over here, so obviously this is something I would recommend for someone like that, although not necessarily for someone that's never touched a plastic model kit in their life. This is something that I would recommend if this is your second, third, or possibly fourth build, and by then you should definitely have your skill sets to a point where a build like this definitely becomes viable. And along similar lines, if you are an older builder or someone that went out of the hobby a number of years ago for one reason or another, but are looking to get back into the hobby, then this kit here is a very nice welcome mat. You can basically pick up one of these, dust off your old skills, and have absolutely no problems with reacclimating yourself with the skills required to build plastic models. It's much easier to do it with one of these than, say, something again from Dragon or similar. Being a 1/35 scale Panzer IV pattern vehicle, there are an almost endless amount of detailed aftermarket parts out there to be added to this thing to spice it up and enhance it from the stock offering. Basically, anywhere on this vehicle I can point to with a stick, there's going to be about 3 or 4 different aftermarket parts out there, from replacement workable tracks to new road wheels, photo etch, cast resin, 3D print, turned aluminum, you name it. There's something out there for this model. And although all those fittings can be added to it and will improve it, in my opinion, it's not really worth it. Or I should say, if you're looking for a good candidate for those type of upgrades, there are lots of other kits out there that are, again, more accurate compared to this older kit over here. But having said that, they can be added to this model to improve it further. If it's worth it or not, as I usually say, this is best left up to the discretion of the builder. Outside of those individuals, I would also recommend this kit for anyone who's just a fan of German World War II armor, or World War II armor in general. If you're a person that digs the German zoo, the Panzer IV ausf.D kit here from Tamiya is definitely one that I recommend to add to your collection. Along similar lines, if you're a fan of the Panzer IV family of vehicle and you love to have and collect all of the vehicles in the range with all the different versions in the alphabet, this kit here is also recommended. Even though, again, generally those type of people are looking for something that is more higher fidelity and has better tooling, that doesn't necessarily outrule this kit, and this kit can be added to your collection and will still enhance it either way. This kit, being a kit from Tamiya, also makes it very collectible, and you can actually build this model in about 3 or 4 different configurations, and all of which build very well and will again enhance any of those collections. Back to what I said before about being a Tamiya kit, Tamiya kits are ridiculously collectible, and they're also fun to collect, and there's just something about having all of the kits in the range, be it from the newest, latest, and greatest, to the ones from the 90s era, and also the ones that came out before in the 70s. There's just something really cool about having the whole spectrum in your collection. And with this kit here being as easily available and as affordable as it is, this definitely scratches that vintage tank collecting itch without breaking the bank. And the very last person who I recommend this kit to, and yes, this is something I have to absolutely say, otherwise it would be video malpractice, would be anyone Who's a fan of the anime girls and Panzers? That's right, yes, I have to bring that up. I have to say it because it's true. The Panzer IV ausf.D was very highly seen in that anime, specifically Season 1, up until the mid-season when they replaced the short barrel 75 with a long barrel 75, making it the Mark IV Special. Even though to do that, you also have to change the front armor and add the shirts in, but that's anime land. Either way, if you're a fan of that anime, you're going to want to add this kit to your collection for a few reasons. Much of which is already said before, the availability, the cost, and the ease of construction. But also, yes, there are aftermarket decals out there on the internet that replace the kit ones, and you can have Team Anglerfish represented in your collection. All things considered, this is an absolute awesome kit, and it's just great to add to your collection, no matter who you are. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale German Panzer IV ausf.D medium tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/35th scale model showcase videos like the one that you just watched, or the other larger scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.